So yes, I was supposed to come to Stanford in person last spring, and part of kind of a tour of Cali, kind of going up and down, giving some talks, talking to various people, but sadly that didn't happen. So now I'm here in my living room at 9 p.m. on a Friday night. So, you know, the pandemic doesn't mean we can't have any fun. And I'm going to talk to you about, it's a talk around the paper that I wrote called The Technology Panics. But I will extend it in certain ways, but do kind of Google the title and read the paper if there's certain things you feel like you want more detail on, or you want some references. So I'm going to skim over some ideas in the process. So to talk about technology panics and to really think about them in a perspective, I'll go through both kind of the past of technology research from a behavioral perspective. So it might not be the perspective you're used to in HCI. I come from a kind of different background, but also the present. And in doing so, I'm kind of forced to also think about the future. As Jeff said, most of my work is actually kind of on the ground, looking at social media effects on mainly teenagers. I'm kind of branching out more, trying to do a bit more developmental science as we speak. But I'm kind of on the ground tech. Over the last couple of years, I started actually reading more about what past researchers have done. And this has really caused me to do some severe introspection, which is where this paper came from and these ideas came from. So I love the opportunity to present them to different disciplines and a wider audience and students. The paper that really started me on this journey of trying to understand what I was even doing in technology research in terms of what's my place in this world of the past and the future and the present was this paper from the Journal of Pediatrics, published in 1941. It was written by Mary Preston, actually probably quite nearby where some of you are sitting, the Bay Area. She was working in San Francisco, but also in the kind of digging I did. She also worked at Stanford, studying children and how they interact with media. And actually in the 1940s, we didn't have smartphones. She was looking at movies at home, but in public kind of movies and movie theaters, and radio, which was coming into the home and changing how children kind of live their lives. I actually stumbled across this paper while writing up the introduction to my thesis in Oxford. And it really made me think. Mary Preston studied about, I think 114, I'm probably wrong, but around that number of children, American children in San Francisco and the Bay Area, to look at how they reacted to movies and the radio. And what she found is that these terrifying scenes, she called them in terms of the radio or the movies they were watching, that these could have an inhibitory effect on every function and every organ in the body. And that over half of her sample was actually severely addicted to the radio and to movie dramas, and that most of them utilize this addiction as an escape from reality, much as a chronic alcohol. You know, I thought this was quite amusing at first, and maybe you do too, because naturally we don't really think of the radio as addictive anymore. Many parents, you know, now with COVID are probably happy if their children would listen to a bit more radio rather than being on their smartphones or on social media. But naturally at this time, this was serious research. So we need to think about it in some more perspective. Here you see a picture from the Library of Congress of people milling around one of these first radios. And actually in the late 1930s, when this paper was written, there was a massive increase in the amount of radios in American homes. In the 1930s, there was around 40% of US households that owned a radio. Well, in the 1940s, it was already over 80%. So this was a massive social change, a change that caused change in how people interact and how people live their lives and the time they spend with certain media. Actually, this wasn't just a change with adults. This was a change with children. Children started spending more time, 1 to 3 hours a day, listening to the radio. And so there was also a change in how they spend their leisure time. So it was actually a situation similar to now, maybe a bit less extreme now with COVID-19, but we have a vast increase in a certain type of new technology use, and that's changing how we interact and how we spend our time, especially that of kind of vulnerable populations that we're often more interested in. Just to bring home the point that that kind of the concerns about the radio are almost interchangeable with the concerns we have about smartphones and social media now, I've created a little quiz. Naturally, we can't do this in person. I have done this in person multiple times, so I will just kind of estimate probably how many of you got the question right or wrong. It's probably not very good. But what I've done is I've selected a couple of quotations and I read them to you, and I just want you to think about whether this quotation is about the radio or about the smartphone. So it should be quite simple. So the first quotation is, "No locks will keep this intruder out, nor can parents shift their children away from it." So let you give a bit of a think. What I normally get in an audience in the kind of 3 times I've given a similar version of this beginning of this talk is that over 0.5% say that this is about the radio. And most of those, they're correct. This was actually written in 1935 as a quote from the director of the Child Study Association of America. So let's try another one. "Here's a device that is everywhere. We may question the quality of its offering for our children. We may entertainments and enchantments, but we are powerless to shut it out. It comes into our very homes and captures our children before our very eyes." So is this quote about the radio, about smartphones? Here, normally people are more torn. There's normally about 50-50. And it's actually still about the radio. This is from 1939, a parenting magazine about the radio here. Even though I think you could say smartphone and people wouldn't really be surprised if somebody said this today. The law says giving your child a blank is like giving them a gram of cocaine. This might be a bit easier. Most people guess the smartphone and they are correct. So this is a newspaper headline from the UK that I just kind of shamefully copied, shamelessly. Well, kind of shamefully. I think it's a bad headline. So I hope they're convincing you that actually the concern about radio is really seemingly similar to concern about the smartphone and about social media. And it surprised me as a researcher in that space to read something where I feel like I could have just changed radio to the social media in that paper from Mary Preston in 1941. And probably that research, would have kind of made a bit of sense today, 80 years later. So the idea, the kind of basic idea of the paper and my talk are that technological panics, these concerns that we have about new technologies that reach a certain threshold of popularity in society, that these concerns are inherently cyclical. They seem to always reoccur in quite similar guises, quite kind of with similar concerns and similar worries for technologies at hand, whether that's the bicycle or the radio or the smartphone. Actually, I'm not the first to say this. This has been an idea that's been floating around in the ether of scientific and public thought for a long, long time. For example, here in 1935, Grunberg was reflecting about the radio and saying that looking backward, the radio appears about the latest of cultural emergence to invade the putative privacy of the home. Each such invasion finds the parents unprepared, frightened, resentful, and helpless. Within comparatively short time, the movie, the automobile, the telephone, the list goes on, and the cheap paperback book have had similar effects upon the apprehensions and solicitudes of parents. So here, she's already making the point of this cycle of concern that has been going on till the radio in her day and social media for us now. So what are these concerns linked to? They're often linked to the kind of things that happen in society that probably happen at all times or that gradually grow and wane and grow again over time. One example of that is youth violence. Greek philosophers were already complaining about the youth violence in their day. So this is not a new problem, but it's continually often linked to new technologies and new media arising. Friedrich Wertham, in a book that communication scholars probably know quite well, in 1954, linked comic books to recent increases in youth violence. Just a couple years, 25 years later, there was another increase in youth violence in the US, and there was a youth as media task force that linked television viewing to that increase. At school, I remember being taught about kind of television content increasing violence and being asked to write essays about that topic. And just last summer in the UK, there was an increase in knife crime, teenagers stabbing each other, a huge problem. And it was very quickly linked to YouTube and grime music and social media. So again, there's this cycle where seemingly very identical issues are being linked to the kind of new technology at hand. So there seems to be something that is repeating over time, something that is identical, whether we're in the 1930s or in the 2020s, and how we react and think about these new technologies. What I argue, though, is that there has been kind of a major change in the last century, and that is the role of science. It's part of being at a university, either as a student or an academic. I think we need to reflect more about what it means to be a scientist in our age, and I'll just try to give you a snapshot of that in these next few slides. Over the last century, the role of science has really changed. There's been the amount of scientists doing their work and the amount of people going to university, and the amount of evidence that is delivered to make policy. We now feel that we should do, evidence-based policy, which is, I think is a good thing, but that means that there should be a lot more evidence available. We see science as a guiding light for issues like parenting, which maybe 100 years ago would still mainly be driven by common sense or by what community leaders or religious leaders or your family has done for many, many decades. So with the role of science changing, the role of science in this technology cycle is also changing. So for example, if you look at the technology panic about the bicycle, there are a couple of newspaper articles with experts saying that, riding a bicycle could drive women insane, or riding a bicycle changed your brain. But there wasn't any concrete research stream. With the radio, however, we started seeing these real scientific papers being written and considered by kind of the public and by policymakers and by other researchers. This was magnified even more with comic books. There were full-on books written. And for example, Friedrich Wertham was quoted by a policymaker in the US as being a really great source of inspiration, and that he actually led to some really quite restrictive comic book legislation being passed. Television led to even more research being done. There are now full-on teams. In the UK, there were kind of quite amazing ventures to study the effects of technology, of television being rolled out to quite rural parts of the east of England, where near Cambridge, where they hadn't gotten television yet. And so they rolled it out in waves, and they considered what changes children were experiencing having gotten a television through a large governmental project the books about in libraries today. And with video games, I think, you now had full-on research teams, especially in psychology. There were a lot of teams kind of battling each other about the effects of violent video games. The World Health Organization is looking into it. So there's a whole research ecosystem. And I feel like that's only been magnified by smartphones and social media, where just today I've talked to researchers here at Stanford, many of them looking into things to do with these current technologies. So our role and our number has really been increasing over time. But the question is, what does this mean? A lot of the ideas here were based on discussions I had with Jerry Ravitz. He still lives in Oxford at age of 92, a scientific philosopher who I feel like wrote a very underappreciated book to do with, well, it says on the the title said all science problems, where he talked about this industrialization of science, this increase of the number of scientists doing their work, and also the increase in how we do our work. Back in the 19th century, or even before that, being a researcher was a very privileged position. It was often very rich men being able to just follow their interests and dabble in what they're interested in, or they were at least supported by very rich individuals to do so. And so there wasn't any pressure really. There was pressure in its sorts, and I'm happy to have a detailed conversation about that. But there wasn't any kind of direction from government as such. Now this is completely changed. This is kind of the slide. I covered the first part already, but as scientists, we now operate mainly in terms of funding from governments, from research councils, with that often give that fund a specific idea in mind of a problem they want to solve, or at least an area they think is important to address. And so as scientists, we operate in a very industrialized space where we are expected to solve practical problems in society. So for example, we as scientists have to win certain amounts of funding, or at least support, to do our work. And that's often by showing that our work is really relevant, that it's solving an issue, if that's climate change or mental health or something else. And so we're incentivized to do work that solves practical problems, that shows that it has impact, that is of interest to a broader scientific kind of and non-scientific audience. And so we're operating in this industrialized space, and we're actually quite active actors in terms of what research we do, because we are led by kind of what funding is available and what are the topics of interest. Going down this rant in terms of kind of science as a whole, but I think it's important to frame it as such to really understand why I think it's important to talk about what I call the Sisyphean cycle of technology panics. So the Sisyphean cycle of technology panics I named after King Sisyphus. He was part of Greek mythology, a king who kind of thought he was better than the gods, who duped the gods on multiple times. He escaped the underworld. He did all these naughty different things. And so at one point, the gods were like, no, you can't do this anymore. And they banished him to roll this boulder up the hill for eternity. He has to do it for eternity because whenever the boulder reaches the top, it just rolls back down, and he has to go back down and do it all over again. So this is a quite never-ending, futile cycle. But there's been a lot of debate of Greek mythology, whether Sisyphus actually knew this was going on, or whether not, or whether he was happy, or whether he was not. I'll leave that to the classicists to debate further. But I think there are parallels to technology researchers. Technology research is driven by a new technology causing concern, causing interest in society that leads groups of researchers to start studying that, whether that be social media or maybe specifically TikTok now or radio. And so you're rolling the boulder up the hill. It's actually quite inefficient because there's no real basis for the research, not a lot of theoretical grounding at least. And so people are kind of really trying to roll that boulder up the hill to create that scientific understanding. But before they reach the top, before real kind of the understanding can be, for example, moved into a change in policy or a change in regulation to help society with technology, what happens is that a new technology comes around. Something new is invented. For the radio, it might have been television. And all of a sudden, television is there, and people become a lot more interested in television. The public isn't really concerned about the radio anymore. I don't care if my child's listening to radio. I care about whether they're in front of the telly. And so the boulder rolls back down, and a lot of the research is forgotten in the process. And so all of a sudden, a new group of researchers kind of assembled and starts rolling the kind of boulder up the hill for this new technology. And so in this very inefficient cycle, not a lot of progress is made in terms of policy. And that's really the heart of my argument for today. And actually, this might seem kind of a bit far-fetched, especially as I was just one of those researchers, and I'm still one of those researchers kind of patiently rolling my boulder up the hill and kind of reaping the benefits in terms of the scientific incentive structure. But I'm going to try to explain it in terms of a cycle with different stages. So when I started my undergrad, I actually thought I'd be a physicist. I think my parents are very disappointed when I switched into psychology. But during kind of undergrad physics lectures, an understanding that you get is that if an event occurs over and over again, it's probably driven by similar forces. And I think this is similar to the cycle of technology panics. And the forces are the public, so the normal person, the politicians and the policymakers who kind of have to react to what the electorate, so what kind of people think and society thinks. And the third force is academia, so academics and researchers doing their job. And these forces interact in different ways at different parts of the cycle. And so I will go through these different stages in turn. The first stage is panic creation. So once a new technology is formed, why do we become concerned about it? So there are often kind of a variety of different reasons why kind of a technology reaching a certain threshold of popularity in society causes concern. And so I'll cover a couple of those in that part of the talk. The second step is then political outsourcing. So this panic has been created. It's almost quite a natural process that people become concerned about a new technology that is becoming very popular, that is, taking the interests of their children, for example. And that creates a pressure on politicians and government to react. You need to be seen to do something, to want to do kind of good policy, to want to protect vulnerable groups. And I'll explain how the incentive system for politicians kind of attuned to them fanning these flames of concern rather than quenching them. So all of a sudden, there are loads of concerns, politicians have to do something, and so more evidence is needed, and there's outsourcing to researchers. There's funding calls, there is kind of increases of interest that lead researchers to start doing more and more work in this area. However, because the research isn't really built on underlying theoretical understanding, a red thread that maybe runs through all sorts of technology research over time, there's a lot of reinventing of the wheel, which is step 3. So that various issues lead to quite an inefficient accumulation of evidence, which leads to step 4, where there's been actually very little progress of kind of evidence creation. There's still a lot of debate. There's maybe a lot of kind of researchers battling with each other, opinions, and that leads to actually policymakers and government not having a good amount of evidence to build very effective policy on. And often, instead of getting effective policy, what happens is that just a new panic emerges. A new technology comes around and the cycle just restarts. So I'll go through these in turn. So the first is panic creation. So how do we get there? What makes us concerned about a new technology? Well, there's been a lot of different approaches, and I'll just sample a couple of them. But the first is technological determinism. So this idea in society that kind of many of us share, that technologies are basic and quite fundamental conditions that really affect us as a society. And crucially, that they're really important drivers of change. In short, it means that we treat technologies as though they are really, really impactful in society, and that we probably can't really impact them back. They change us. We can't really change them. We're kind of left out in the open to kind of deal with the changes we're left with. And so technological determinism sees technology as really a defining kind of factor of change that is going to affect and change our society. And that is really probably causing most of the change, or some of these important changes we are seeing at the time that we're living and kind of coping by. So what happens when we see technologies as the main actors of change? Well, it means that they can be very quickly linked to any ongoing and probably quite complicated societal changes. For example, this could be increases in youth violence, as we've seen kind of on a very early slide. There's been increases in youth violence at many points in history, and they've been often linked to other increases in youth, even though probably an increase in youth violence can be driven by a lot of different factors. Another quite kind of current example is a decrease in adolescent mental health, the area that I work in. For example, in the United States, we started seeing quite a drop in adolescent mental health in around 2010. And that has been very quickly and quite compellingly linked to, for example, the creation of the smartphone at kind of a similar time. And so that the increase of smartphone use was actually causally related to that decrease in adolescent mental health that we saw. Naturally, that change in adolescent mental health can be a lot of things. It could be due to kind of straggling effects of the economic crisis that was affecting families. In the UK, for example, it could be due to cuts in mental health services that were done at this time, cuts in child services, increasing pressures in families to do well, society, and maybe living in a world that is less just, or perceived to be less just at least. Or it could be a change in how young people now interpret mental health questions, as we naturally have a different way of talking about mental health now than we did a decade ago. But the link to technology is still one of the most compelling and most often kind of taken up in public discourse.
I have a question about the mental health one.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I thought that was really interesting that maybe it was possible due to the, what do we call, the Great Recession. I'm wondering if we saw similar mental health issues in Australia, where their economy was much less impacted by the Great Recession.
Yeah, so that's actually been a comment that has often been made by journalists to me. For example, it was first made by a journalist at The Economist when many years ago, when I wasn't kind of this meta perspective. And what we have seen, for example, and I don't know as much in Australia, but for example, in Germany, we've not seen concurrent decreases in mental health in the last couple of years. Even though they have a similar increase in technology. And something that somebody in my lab is trying to get data on is for example, in Asia, and for example, South Korea, there was an earlier uptick in use of technology by young people. And so if that kind of hypothesis were correct, then we would have expect to kind of see a quicker kind of, or an earlier downturn in terms of adolescent mental health. In terms of Australia, I don't know the data there in terms of kind of the economic recession. But I think what we see is that the picture is a lot less clear than, there's one driver, for example. And a lot of psychometricians that I work with also think that it has a lot to do with the change in how we interpret. So I know this distinction, but I don't have the data to Australia at hand.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I was bringing up Australia mainly because it may be closer culturally, let's say, than South Korea or China or other countries. Yeah.
No, and I think that cross-cultural comparisons are really crucial to this one and are of interest. The last example I wanted to raise was quite recently in terms of 5G. 5G, that 5G has, for example, been rolled out starting to roll out across the UK, and it has been quite actively linked to COVID-19, which is actually a change that is also happening at the time. Again, it seems at least to be quite a compelling narrative for people. What happens so there seems to be a very easy linkage between changes in technology and in society at the time. So that can be kind of a first cause of concern, actually. Another way that sociologists, for example, have thought about it is the term of moral panics, coined by Cohen, I think in his PhD thesis. And he wrote about these concerns that at times certain concerns reach a real kind of high point in society, and that kind of magnifies a concern in very specific ways. And he calls these moral panics. So times when worries really reach a widespread popularity, and they're often associated with when people see something as a threat to what it means to be human, or it means to be a member of the society or the group they see themselves part of. And so, for example, technology can challenge what we feel like it means to be us, or it means to be communicating, or it means to be a child. And that can cause searching and quite a moral reaction at times. And we often see that moral reaction and condemnation shared by societal leaders, for example, kind of people in the media, religious leaders, school leaders, or politicians that can share this idea and agree with it, and therefore amplify this concern even more. Interestingly, in the literature about moral panics, they often talk about that a lot of moral panics are centered about the other, so that we're concerned about somebody else that's not us. And it's often a more vulnerable population. So for example, we're concerned about children, but we think that we can self-regulate our tech use, or we're concerned about women becoming insane on bicycles, but not actually kind of us if we were all men in, you know, I guess the early 1900s, or immigrants. And so there's a really nice quote, which I didn't put on the slide, that in moral panics, the power holders of society are often interesting to the effects of the panic itself, kind of, for example, the technology. And so technological determinism and moral panics, and actually a lot of other factors interact to often create quite an increase of concern in the population about the new technology at hand. Actually, this is a very quick introduction to something that is a lot more complicated. But it does seem like every single time a new technology passes a certain threshold and influences vulnerable groups like children, people do become concerned, and it follows very similar pathways. So what now happens is that there's a population of people who are concerned and who want change, who want something done. And so what you go is to go to step 2 of political outsourcing. Again, this is in a way a simplified narrative as some really interesting work out there about the political benefits of these societal panics, and people have written about these. So the first is that if you're, for example, a politician or in government, a panic around the new technology allows you to demonstrate that you're kind of willing to stand up to emerging technology companies. And we've seen this, for example, with television, politicians quite in high offices of government standing up to new kind of television companies, and then actually using that as a basis to run for higher office, like for president. I forgot the name of the person actually, but I used to know, and it's in the paper. But so there's quite a compelling narrative about saying, I'm going to stand up to these new tech companies. And also that you show that you're concerned for children and vulnerable populations. But the last point on the slide is the most important, at least, or at least the most compelling for me. And that is that kind of taking this narrative of a tech panic on board allows you to deflect attention from maybe more difficult or uncomfortable issues. So for example, and actually I'm based in the UK, and we also have had a downturn in adolescent mental health. And this could be, again, due to austerity. That was a governmental policy to really cut back on a lot of youth clubs and youth support and child mental health support. And there's not been a lot of kind of investment in that area. But naturally, if you say, yes, that might be due to it, and you're the politician from the party who actually enacted that change, you are shooting yourself in the foot. Another option is that it's societal pressures, or it might be, for example, with the knife crime in London, you might personally think as a politician that it might be down to parenting or not having enough support for parents, or parents not being kind of, but if you start blaming parents, you're starting to blame your electorate. And again, that's not the best way to be seen to the public and in the media. So actually blaming YouTube is a pretty nice option. And we've seen this time and time again, that blaming technology companies and saying you'll stand up to technology companies makes very positive headlines. For example, our health minister in the UK has kept on, since there's a big scare in self-harm images on Instagram, And he was repeatedly in the media saying that, you know, I'll stand up to Instagram to purge self-harm and suicide posts. I'll make sure that they regulate, and I'll push regulation through. And now 3 years later, we've seen little change, but he still has this kind of positive media backing that he had at that time. And so we have kind of politicians not being incentivized to subdue the concerns, but probably incentivized to actually use that narrative, because it allows them to really have quite an easy narrative to go with. And so over time, politics goes on to kind of encourage science, or the increasing interest doesn't have to just be through politics, increases more and more scientific research in this area to really look at, you know, what this new technology might be like. Are the concerns valid? Should we really be concerned about adolescent mental health and social media? And that is because, in a way, science provides reassurance and comfort to people. Another idea that Jerry Ravitz raised in his book on scientific knowledge and its social problems. Science calms the fears and concerns of populations and naturally puts the onus on the scientists to now solve the issue, to gather the evidence. It buys time to kind of creating policy, to force Instagram to remove sample. And so there's a lot of outsourcing via funding or commissioning, or at least incentivizing research by giving it airtime and referencing it and encouraging it. This means that researching a new technology implicated in a panic is very incentivized. I probably wouldn't be here talking to you if I wouldn't have researched social media at a time of high public and policy interest. There's a lot of funding in the space that's especially important in this industrialized state of science, where we need to bring in that funding to survive in a very competitive space. There's prestige done with it, that comes with it, or media attention. And you're studying something that society is interested in. Naturally, that's personally incentivizing as well. It's nice to study something that people actually care about. And so there are a lot of kind of aligning of incentives that drives researchers into that space, and really often increases the number of people researching this area by a short space of time. They're not actually the kind of core researchers who've researched it from the very beginning, but that number is increased by a lot in a very short succession. The core issue that I want to highlight with this change, with this influx of scientists, is that most of them are motivated because they want to solve the societal issue. And you often see that in introductions to papers around, for example, social media, but also in Mary Preston's work, for example, about the radio. People don't say, I studied this, I studied social media because there was this theory which I wanted to test about social media. They say, I studied social media's effect on adolescents because people are really concerned, or because now 80% of adolescents now use more than X amount of social media per day. And so the whole research is framed in, we have a problem, we have a concern, that makes sense of it. Instead of maybe in how we traditionally conceptualize science as a kind of scientific process in terms of testing a universal scientific theory that maybe a field is built on. For example, a very common example of that is we had a theory that the sun revolved around the earth and all the planets revolved around the earth, and researchers and scientists probed and tested that over long periods of time. They adapted that theory if they found that evidence didn't really fit with it. And then at one point they decided to change it completely. There was a kind of paradigm shift, and all of a sudden people started believing that the sun was the center of the universe. And so then people started testing and probing that theory and developing it further, and then different branches of, for example, astronomy and physics branched from there. And so there's a real red thread running through the field and running through these ideas and how they're generated. While it might still be parts of this technology research space, but a lot of this new research being done on that technological panic at hand is actually quite theory-free. It's kind of there in space trying to solve the problem. And we'll talk a lot more about why I think that might cause certain issues further down the line. Because now we've kind of stopped being in the second part of a cycle, and we've entered the third. We've entered kind of the area of researchers, of people I'm talking to, or at least students. If you're watching this talk, this is the world you're bordering at. This is the people you're interacting with and learning from. So what are we doing in terms of the cycle? The first thing is that naturally we seem to be going through very similar stages to our predecessors. Just like I was shocked that in the 1940s, very similar papers were written that could have been written today, just about a different technology. Again, people have realized it. For many, in 1951, Seago wrote that we seem to always go through the same stages in technology research. For example, the idea or the trope of technology addiction has been raised for radio and comic books and television and video games and social media. And probably in 5 years, we'll be raising it for the new technology we're concerned about, or the new technology at hand. Furthermore, there's been similar questions about social connection or empathy or education or concentration that have been raised time and time again. And so researchers have argued that we often seem to overlook that novel technologies share more similarities and differences with its predecessors, kind of forget all the work that's come before, and kind of reinvent the wheel from scratch and for example, treat TikTok as entirely new. Naturally, this is kind of, again, an oversimplification. I'm taking things to the top and like exaggerating them a bit. Very talented researchers trying to spin that red thread throughout the whole kind of technology research space. But again, I feel like those are in the severe minority. So we're back to that issue. What happens if we don't have that red thread? What happens when most of us actually just want to solve the societal problem, maybe because of our own interest or because of incentives, and therefore are focused on this part of the slide rather than that? To understand that, we can actually go to some of the really classic scientific philosophers like Kuhn, who wrote in 1962 that without an underlying paradigm, so without an underlying theory in a kind of pre-paradigmatic state, as he always said, without an underlying paradigm to guide research, each researcher is forced to build his or her field anew from its foundations. So we as researchers need to create new methods. We need to think about new benchmarks, new approaches, and we need to build that from scratch because we don't have that coming kind of with it and develop over time. Further, he noted, I think more interestingly, that such a pre-paradigmatic time should be marked by frequent and deep debates over legitimate methods, problems, and standards of solutions, though these serve rather to define schools than to produce agreement. So what he says here is that if there is no universal theory, if there's no red thread running through a research area, then there should be really deep debates about what good science looks like. What problems should we solve? What does good stand for? What are the methods we should use? And over time, researchers will entrench into their separate views and probably not reach any sort of scientific consensus. Again, I would argue that is in technology research. For example, in the violent video game area, we've had separate groups of research areas really kind of battling it out in the trenches for very, very long periods of time. A good overview of that is Malta Elson's and Chris Ferguson's paper about 25 years of violent video game research. So over time, researchers have kind of had different ideas of what good research looks like. They have different ideas of what the technology might be doing. And actually probably giving them another 25 years of time will not help them reconcile their differences. So there is this entrenching that doesn't lead to consensus. Similarly, for social media, I've myself been part of quite kind of vigorous academic debate that even kind of left the academic context and went into the media about what good social media, whether social media effects are a thing or not a thing. And so again, I think that some of these disagreements might not be solved by just giving us an additional 5 years, which is quite a kind of sad thought. And maybe I'm just being a bit too pessimistic. But it is interesting that what Kuhn hypothesized, that kind of a and he wasn't thinking about technology research, he was thinking about science as a whole. Well, he hypothesized what a pre-paradigmatic state of research should look like, and what Jerry Ravitz hypothesized what a kind of non-theoretical pre-kind of scientific field should look like seems to be the case in a lot of technology research today. So because of these inefficiencies and this wheel reinvention and these debates, there's actually very little consensus at the end of the day. You know, we might have, for social media now, we might have 10 years of research to build on. We actually know very little that can actually concretely be policy change into, for example, thinking about whether and how we should regulate social media. So we come to the fourth stage. So we're going back to government and policymakers, which is naturally where we kind of want to end up, even as scientists. We want our work to enact positive change long-term in society. I think that's why many of us are in this field in the first place. So what are the options now that there's actually been very little evidence created? There's maybe not yet a consensus. There's still very, very vicious debate. So what can you do if you do want to enact policy change? So let me think about what I want to say at the end. Sorry, I'm just looking through my slides. I think I'm going to just summarize at the end then that what we have is a cycle that makes things very, very inefficient. It actually leaves policymakers very little option for what to do. And we need to really rethink then how we can solve that cycle. And I guess because I can't really get to that last 5 minutes of my talk, do have a look at the paper. I write in kind of great detail what I think could be done better. And I think we could improve our research, we could accelerate our research, but then we could also think about what do we do if scientific consensus is just never quick enough for actually to enact policy change. And I think in accelerating digital century of the 21st century, technological innovation is really, really rapid. We might really think about kind of new ways to approach that problem and to mitigate this cycle of technology panics. And yeah, please ask me any questions.
Thank you so much. And we do have a number of questions in the queue. I'll start with one, and then, but panelists, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask questions. Asks a question, wondering whether technology is linked to the social changes because it's concrete, like you can point at it, and because it's new and unknown, like making it some sort of easy scapegoat, or is there something else going on?
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think it is probably true. You know, I'm not a huge expert in exactly that area, and the way I've been trying to bring everything to think that because it's new and it's concrete, and we see it as concrete. And actually, I'm currently working on a project where we're actually saying that naturally social media is changing over time. We see it as a concrete thing because it's new, but naturally it is developing as well. So maybe our heuristics in how we approach technology as it being this unifying thing that is so impactful does make it easy to link it to concerning changes.
Panelists, this is your opportunity.
I'll just follow up on that, Amy. Some of the other questions were really about, is it different now? And I like your answer, like, yes, it's changing. But for example, with the radio, do we have sort of like variable schedule reinforcement dynamics taking place? And so I really don't like the addiction metaphor, but it's such a powerful one. And with the Social Dilemma Netflix movie coming out, that's their central argument, is that these are being designed for addiction. So do you have any thoughts there that there's something fundamentally different about technology now?
Yeah, it's a common question, and I think that naturally at every point of different technological developments, people thought they were different, and that's why they were important. So I think in a way we need to keep that in mind, but naturally we might be at a different turning point. We might be at a point where actually we need to act, and we won't find it funny in 10 years time. And that might be true. And I think that's why we need to take this cycle really seriously. How can we create evidence quicker to actually enact positive policy change? And that's because there's a lot of thought around kind of when can you actually, for example, seriously change social media. I don't think we can change social media seriously anymore. We can change certain types of funding structures, but people now build their livelihoods on social media. We have our society built around social media. So it's entrenched. That's how kind of people say that technology is entrenched over time. So if you really want to make a change, you need to make it really quick. If you really want to change it, and it might be that, we should have made a change now, but we actually don't know. So we need to get a lot better at actually understanding if we need to make a change very quickly, or we need to take more gambles in terms of regulation, or there's a lot of ideas out there. But I think we need to get better, because maybe this time is special, but probably we'll get something at some point where we want to act. We're going to live in a digitalized society, and we already are. So I think that if we should be concerned now, or if we should be concerned in 20 years, we need a better system in place.
Q&A is also asking, how do we differentiate the sort of true negative effects of this technology from the sort of repeating, right? If we have a signal that's repeating, we should be able to sort of subtract it out, so to speak, and say, okay, that's cyclical, but this harm or this concern really is important and unique and something we need to attend to.
I think that goes back down to theory, and I wish I had time to kind of talk about some of the core theoretical approach, for example, in communication, things like the displacement hypothesis, or in affordances. And these allow us to link older technologies to newer technology and really think about the differences over time. And so maybe a way to subtract things out is to really think about what is different now from, for example, TikTok from Facebook, and then actually test exactly that difference, and not just the whole technology as a whole. So I think if we approach it with that red thread and with the comparisons technologies of the past, it should be easier for us to subtract out that base level of concern. I think we're not there yet.
Panelists, we have time for maybe one more question, if any of you wants to jump in.
Maybe I can ask one question. So very interesting talk, and I'm really interested in that cycle. One question that I'm curious about is that because my impression is that the technology development is speeding up. Does that cycle speeds up as well as the effect, or it's relative the same? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because that's something that I've thought about, and I don't actually know. So it could be that technological development is going to be so fast that actually maybe the cycle stopped really making a difference, because we don't have these upticks of concern, because it's like sped up so much, or because technological change becomes less kind of massive in one go, but more continuous. And, we've seen that, for example, with how smartphones develop. It's kind of becoming more of the same with smaller changes rather than big new releases. So I think it might be that by changing the way that technologies innovate, the cycle will change in the future. We just don't really know. It's good to understand maybe what is driving it, to then see whether there are changes going forward. But thanks for this great question.
Excellent. And thank you, Amy, for joining us in our inaugural seminar of the year. We're all thrilled to have you here. And if you could see us and hear us, there would be clapping and things, but you'll just have to imagine it. So thanks again, and hope you have a great rest of your day.